In the dark streets of 1970s Harlem, a man created an organization so strong that he started calling himself Mr. Untouchable. But no matter how strong an empire is, it will always come crashing down at some point. This is the story of how Nicky Barnes rose to power and then spectacularly fell. He became the most wanted criminal in America, and he did something nobody expected. But before we get into this amazing true story, I want to know where you are watching this from right now. Write your city and the current time where you are in the comments down below. And if you want to learn all about one of the most interesting criminal minds in American history, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Believe me, you will want to stick around to see how this story ends. The year was 1977, and Harlem was moving to a dangerous beat over on 116th Street. Fancy cars with dark windows rolled past old run-down apartment buildings. Inside those vehicles sat men who got more respect than government officials, caused more fear than military leaders, and had more money than most company bosses. At the very top of this hidden kingdom stood a man who would become famous, a warning to others, and finally one of the most debated characters in America's criminal past. But to really get how Nicky Barnes fell, we have to first understand how he got to the top. We need to go back to a Harlem where hopes for a better life disappeared quickly, where staying alive meant being clever, and where a kid's strong wish to break free from being poor would turn him into the biggest drug dealer in America and later into the government's most helpful snitch. October 15th, 1933. The entire world was struggling through the Great Depression, and you could see it most clearly in Harlem, New York. While business leaders downtown were jumping out of skyscraper windows in lines for free food stretched for blocks, a baby boy named Nicholas Barnes came into the world in a dirty apartment building filled with rats on West 146th Street. When he was born, seemed to hint at what was coming. He arrived at a time when the American dream had turned into a bad dream for millions of people, when the usual ways to make something of yourself had fallen apart, and when other methods of surviving and getting ahead were about to take hold. Nicky Barnes, which is what everyone would eventually call him, was born into a Harlem that was nothing like the fancy music club scene that had made the area famous just 10 years before. The time of great black artists and writers had given way to tough economic times. The Cotton Club was still open, but the people who came to spend money traveled from downtown, leaving their cash in places owned by white people, while black families struggled to put food on the table. This was the Harlem that shaped young Mickey's view of the world, a place where legal ways to get ahead were hard to find, where the system was set up against people who looked like him, and where the fastest way to gain respect and safety usually meant breaking the law. His mother, Viola Barnes, held down several different jobs just to keep everyone fed. She cleaned office buildings late at night and did laundry for other people during the day, her hands always raw from strong soap and boiling water. His father, a man who was only around every once in a while, bounced between construction jobs when there was work and sat around unemployed when there wasn't. The Barnes household, just like thousands of others in Harlem, lived right on the edge of survival. Young Mickey figured out pretty early that being hungry wasn't just about needing food. It was about dignity, about being respected, about having power. He watched his mother count pennies to buy milk. He watched the kids who lived nearby go to school wearing shoes held together by tape. He watched older boys his age wear old clothes passed down from someone else, while white kids in the magazines had new outfits for every season. These things he saw settled into his young mind, creating a hunger that regular food could never fill. The streets of Harlem became the place where Nicky got his real schooling. While other children his age paid attention to their classwork, Nicky was picking up different kinds of lessons. He figured out that certain street corners were run by certain people. That money moved through the neighborhood through secret channels, and that respect was something more valuable than cash. He learned to notice the small signs of who was in charge on the streets, who stepped aside for who did the talking and who did the listening, who gave orders and who followed them. By the time he was 10 years old, Nicky was already showing the intelligence and charm that would later help him become such a powerful criminal leader. He could win over grown-ups with his fast-talking and confident attitude, but he also had a smart brain that was always figuring out angles and chances. His teachers noticed he was bright, but they also saw that he liked to question people in charge and didn't care much about regular success. What they didn't realize was that Nicky was already getting his real education out on the streets. Nicky's first run-in with the police came when he was 13, something that happened to a lot of boys in Harlem back then. The charge was stealing small stuff. He had gotten caught taking candy from a neighborhood store, but this wasn't just some kid being naughty. It was a planned move based on watching things carefully. Nicky had kept an eye on that store for weeks, noticing when the owner got distracted, when other shoppers created a screen, and when nobody was watching. Even at 13, he was already thinking like someone planning a strategy. The juvenile center where he spent 3 weeks didn't scare him straight like the system hoped it would. Instead, it turned into Nicky's first advanced class in how to be a criminal. He met boys who had pulled off bigger crimes, learned about fancier plans, and started to understand the whole world of crime that existed alongside regular society. Most of all, he figured out that the key to making it in this world wasn't just being brave, but being smart and organized. When he got back to the streets, Nicky was a different person. He carried himself with more confidence, spoke with more authority, and picked up a small group of younger kids who saw him as someone who had faced the system and come out without being broken. This was the start of what would become a pattern for his whole life. Nicky could turn every problem into a chance to grow and every experience into a lesson about power. His teenage years saw him getting more and more involved in street crime. He moved up from stealing small things to more organized stuff like running numbers, watching out for older criminals, and learning the complicated web of relationships that ran Harlem's underground money system. But unlike a lot of other guys his age who were happy with small-time scores, Nicky was always studying the big picture. He wanted to understand not just how to commit crimes, but how to create and run criminal businesses. The summer of 1950, when Nicky was 17, was a turning point. He had gotten arrested again, this time for armed robbery, and was looking at serious prison time. As he sat in his cell waiting for his day in court, he made a decision that would affect the rest of his life. Instead of just accepting that he would be another young black man swallowed up by the system, he decided to focus all his energy on understanding and mastering the rules of the game he had chosen to play. In 1951, with prison time or military service waiting for him, Nicky picked the army. This choice surprised a lot of people who knew him. Why would someone so into street life willingly sign up for military rules and structure? But Nicky's decision showed how strategic his thinking was. He understood that the military would give him skills, discipline, and connections that could help him later in the career path he had picked. His time in the service followed the same pattern that marked his whole life. He did really well at the parts that interested him while getting annoyed at pointless rules. He became an expert in logistics, managing supplies, and coordinating people. These skills, which were meant to help his country, would later be used to run his criminal organization. He also learned about chains of command, how to give orders, and why loyalty and discipline matter in any group. But maybe most importantly, being in the military showed Nicky a bigger world. He served next to guys from different backgrounds, saw different ways of leading people, and gained confidence that he could handle systems much more complicated than the streets of Harlem. When he came back to regular life in 1954, he wasn't just some street-smart kid anymore. He was a sharp young man with a dangerous mix of street knowledge and experience with big institutions. His first tries at getting a regular job didn't really have his heart in them. He worked for a little while in a factory, tried construction, and even spent some time as a shipping clerk. But these jobs felt like being in prison to someone who had gotten a taste of power and excitement. The everyday grind of legal work, with its small paychecks and limited chances to move up, couldn't satisfy the big dreams that had been building inside him since he was a kid. The pull of the streets was just too strong to resist. But when Nicky went back to crime, he brought with him the discipline and organizational skills he had picked up in the military. He wasn't happy anymore with stealing small stuff or running little scams. He had much bigger plans. The late 1950s found Nicky Barnes diving deep into the complicated world of Harlem's criminal money system. But unlike when he was younger and acted without thinking, he now approached crime with the careful planning of a business executive. He spent months watching, learning, and building connections before he made his next move. Harlem during this time was split up into different criminal areas, each controlled by different people or groups. The Italian-American mob had a lot of power, but so did various black criminal organizations, people working on their own, and crooked government figures. Nicky made it his job to understand all of these power setups. He knew that to succeed, he would need to navigate complicated relationships and competing interests. His big break came when he hooked up with Fat Herbie, a mid-level drug dealer who ran several blocks on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Fat Herbie was impressed by Nicky's intelligence and the way he carried himself like a soldier. So he took the younger man under his wing. This friendship gave Nicky his first real education in the drug business, which was still pretty new in New York at that time. Under Fat Herbie's teaching, Nicky learned the basics of drug dealing: where to get supplies, how to mix and package them, how to get them out on the streets, and how to clean the money. But more importantly, he learned about the human psychology that made the business work. He studied the desperation of addicts, what motivated the guys selling on street corners, how police could be bribed, and how politicians just looked the other way. He started to see drug dealing not as just a bunch of separate deals, but as a complicated system that could be made better and bigger. Fat Herbie ran a pretty small operation, but Nicky could see the potential for something much larger. He imagined a drug business that combined the efficiency of a legal company with the big profits of illegal activity. The key, he realized, was organization, discipline, and thinking ahead. These were qualities that were often missing in the criminal world. In 1959, Nicky's connection with Fat Herbie ended suddenly when his mentor got caught in a big federal raid. Instead of running away or hiding, Nicky saw this as his chance. He started reaching out to Fat Herbie's suppliers and customers, presenting himself as the natural person to take over. His military background and natural ability to lead helped him in these talks, and within a few months, he had taken control of most of the territory Fat Herbie used to run. But Nicky had no plans to just keep what he had been given. He had bigger dreams. Dreams that would require connections with more powerful criminal organizations. It was time to build relationships with the Italian-American Mafia families that controlled most of New York's organized crime activity. The early 1960s marked Nicky Barnes' change from a talented street dealer into a major player in New York's drug scene. This change happened because he built relationships with Italian-American crime families, especially the Lucchese family. These connections would give him access to better quality drugs, protection from people trying to compete with him, and most importantly, the organizational knowledge he needed to build a real criminal business. Nicky's first important contact with the Mafia came through Crazy Joe Gallo, a member of the Profassi crime family who was known for having more open-minded views about race and for being willing to work with black criminals. Gallo was impressed by how professional Nicky was and how well he could manage territory without drawing unwanted attention from the police. More importantly, Gallo recognized that Nicky had something that many Italian-American crime figures lacked: a deep understanding of and connections within the black community, which was increasingly running the street-level drug business. Through Gallo, Nicky was introduced to members of the Lucchese family, who controlled most of the heroin coming into the East Coast. The Luccheses were at first doubtful about working with a black criminal since traditional Mafia rules strongly discouraged such relationships. However, Nicky's reputation for being reliable, his smart understanding of business principles, and his proven ability to make serious money slowly won them over. The relationship that developed helped both sides, but was set up carefully. The Italian families gave Nicky access to high-quality heroin brought in from Sicily and Turkey, while he gave them access to sales networks they could never have built on their own. Nicky paid the Italians a cut of his profits and agreed to stay within certain neighborhood boundaries, while they gave him protection from other criminal groups and occasional tips about police activities. Maybe most importantly, Nicky's connection with the Mafia showed him sophisticated organizational structures that would later become the foundation of his own criminal empire. He studied how the families kept their people in line, settled arguments, protected their operations, and managed the complicated details of large-scale criminal businesses. He learned about the importance of staying protected, creating layers of leadership that kept top people away from getting directly involved in day-to-day activities. He watched how successful crime families balanced central control with letting local people make their own decisions. These lessons were not lost on Nicky, who was already forming plans for an organization that would combine the best parts of Mafia structure with new ideas, suited to the unique demands of the drug trade. Unlike the traditional crime families, which were built on ethnic loyalty and family ties, Nicky's organization would be built around business principles and moving up based on how well you did. By 1965, Nicky Barnes controlled a big chunk of Harlem's drug trade, but he knew that how his organization was currently set up wasn't good enough for the growth he had in mind. Running things like a traditional street boss, keeping an eye on everything himself, wasn't efficient and put him at too much risk. He needed a more advanced structure, one that would let the business grow while keeping him protected and making sure people stayed loyal. The solution he came up with was something new in the world of black organized crime. The Council, this group, officially formed in 1967, was Nicky's attempt to create a black version of the Italian-American Mafia Commission. The council had 7 members, each of whom controlled specific areas within Harlem and the neighborhoods around it. Nicky acted as the unofficial chairman, but each member had a lot of freedom within the territory they were assigned. The smart thing about the council was how it mixed working together with competing against each other. Members shared resources, information, and protection, but they also competed with each other for customers and profits. This setup encouraged new ideas and working efficiently, while also providing mutual support against outside threats. It also created multiple streams of money for Nicky, who got a percentage from each member's operations, while also keeping his own direct territories. The original council members were picked carefully based on how well they had proven themselves, how loyal they were to Nicky, and how much control they had over strategic areas. They included Frank James, who ran operations in the Bronx, Guy Fisher, who managed distribution in central Harlem, Ismail Muhammad, who oversaw money cleaning operations, Frank Lucas, who handled connections with suppliers, Thomas Foreman, who managed enforcement and security, and Wallace Rice, who coordinated with crooked police officials. Each council member was expected to run their territory like a real business with detailed record keeping, regular meetings, and standard procedures. Nicky insisted on quality control, good customer service, and professional presentation. Council members were required to dress nicely, speak properly, and act in a way that earned respect instead of fear. This approach was completely new in a criminal world that often emphasized scaring people over being professional. The council also put in place advanced security measures that were way ahead of their time. Members used code names and secret ways of communicating, changed where they met regularly, and used techniques to spot if they were being watched. They kept up legal business fronts, hired top-quality lawyers, and built relationships with crooked officials who could tip them off about police activities. Under Nicky's leadership, the council changed how drug dealing worked in New York City through a series of new ideas that made things more efficient, lowered risk, and maximized profits. These new methods would later be copied by criminal organizations all over the country, making Nicky famous as a criminal leader who could see the future. The first major new idea was putting in place quality control standards that had never been seen before in the drug trade. While most dealers mixed their heroin with dangerous or useless stuff to make more money, the council set strict standards for purity and consistency. They hired chemists to test their product, kept detailed records of what customers thought, and even offered a kind of customer service that included exchanges for bad product. This approach created customer loyalty and let council members charge higher prices for what they sold. The second new idea was creating a smart distribution network that lowered the risk for top members. Instead of using the traditional setup where drugs flowed down through many levels of dealers, the council put in place a cell-based structure where street-level dealers reported to middle managers who had no direct contact with council members. This structure meant that if street-level operations got busted, the damage could be contained without threatening the whole organization. The council also led the way in using legal businesses as covers for cleaning money and distributing drugs. They bought car dealerships, restaurants, dry cleaners, and other cash-heavy businesses that provided cover for their activities. These businesses were run professionally and often became genuinely profitable, giving council members legal sources of income and respected positions in the community. Maybe most importantly, the council built a smart information network that was as good as those of police agencies. They kept detailed files on police officers, federal agents, prosecutors, and judges. They tracked police activities, kept an eye on wiretaps and surveillance operations, and cultivated sources inside government agencies. This information network let them stay one step ahead of law enforcement for years, earning Nicky his nickname, Mr. Untouchable. The success of these new ideas showed up in the council's money performance. By 1970, the organization was bringing in an estimated $1 million per week in total income, with Nicky personally earning more than $1 million per year. These numbers made the council one of the most profitable criminal organizations in American history, and made Nicky Barnes one of the richest criminals in the country. Success brought with it a way of living. It was both the reward for Nicky's achievements and the seed of his eventual downfall. By the early 1970s, Nicky Barnes lived like a king, and he made sure everyone knew it. His flashy display of wealth served multiple purposes. It attracted ambitious young criminals who wanted to join his organization. It scared competitors and possible enemies. And it satisfied his deep psychological need for recognition and respect. Nicky's main home was a fancy apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, far away from the Harlem streets where he had grown up. The apartment was filled with the finest European antique furniture, original artwork, and the latest electronics. He had a full-time cook, housekeeper, and personal assistant, and his closets were stuffed with custom-made suits from the most exclusive tailors in New York and Europe. His car collection was famous, with multiple Cadillacs, Mercedes-Benzes, and other luxury vehicles, each fixed up with special features including bulletproof glass and hidden compartments. He switched cars often, usually driving a different vehicle each day of the week, and he was known for buying new cars on a whim and then just forgetting about them when he got bored. But material things were only one part of Nicky's lifestyle. He was a regular at the fanciest restaurants and nightclubs in New York, always with beautiful women, and always picking up the tab for everyone at his table. He was known for being generous, often giving $1,000 tips to waiters and bartenders, buying drinks for entire nightclubs, and giving expensive gifts to friends and associates. His personal style was unique and carefully created. He liked expensive suits in bright colors, paired with gold jewelry, diamond rings, and custom-made shoes. His hair was always perfectly styled. His nails were professionally done, and he carried himself with the confident attitude of a successful businessman. To people who didn't know what he really did, he seemed to be exactly what he claimed to be, a successful entrepreneur. The women in Nicky's life were treated like extras that came with his success. He kept up relationships with multiple women at the same time, often giving them apartments, cars, and monthly allowances in exchange for their company and keeping quiet. These relationships were more like business deals than real emotional connections, showing Nicky's belief that everything and everyone had a price and could be bought. But maybe the most telling part of Nicky's lifestyle was his need to be recognized in public. Unlike traditional organized crime figures who valued staying anonymous above everything else, Nicky went looking for media attention. He enjoyed being photographed at public events, being mentioned in newspaper gossip columns, and being recognized as a successful businessman. This desire for recognition would eventually turn out to be his biggest weakness. But in the early 1970s, it seemed like just another part of his amazing success story. The summer of 1977 marked both the highest point of Nicky Barnes's power and the beginning of his downfall. On June 5, 1977, the New York Times Magazine published a cover story about Nicky called Mr. Untouchable, featuring a big photograph of him in a suit and turtleneck looking right at the camera with the confident smile of a man who believed nothing could touch him. The article, written by investigative reporter Fred Ferretti, gave a detailed look at Nicky's operation and lifestyle, effectively introducing him to mainstream America as the most powerful drug dealer in the country. The article described Nicky's organization in terms that made it sound more like a Fortune 500 company than a criminal operation. It detailed the council's advanced structure, their business practices, and their enormous profits. It quoted law enforcement officials who admitted they were frustrated at not being able to build a case against someone whose criminal activities were an open secret. Most provocatively, the article quoted Nicky himself, speaking with remarkable honesty about his philosophy and methods. For Nicky, the Times article represented the ultimate proof of his success. He had achieved something that few criminals ever accomplish: mainstream recognition of his power and influence. He was no longer just a street dealer who had made good. He was a national figure, a celebrity criminal who had captured the public's imagination. The article made him feel untouchable in ways that went beyond his ability to avoid law enforcement. It made him feel like a legitimate businessman who just happened to work in an illegal industry. But the article also had consequences that Nicky failed to see coming. President Jimmy Carter, who had made drug enforcement a priority of his administration, reportedly saw the article and demanded to know why such a famous criminal had not been prosecuted. The article got federal law enforcement agencies fired up, and they started working together to target the council in ways they had never done before. It also attracted the attention of rival criminal organizations, some of whom began to see Nicky's high profile as a problem rather than an advantage. Maybe most dangerously, the article changed the dynamics within the council itself. Some members felt that Nicky seeking media attention was bringing unnecessary heat to their operations. They argued that the traditional criminal code demanded staying anonymous, and that Nicky's celebrity was endangering everyone's freedom and profits. These concerns created the first serious cracks in the loyalty that had been the council's greatest strength. The article also had an unexpected effect on Nicky's mind. Having achieved mainstream recognition, he began to believe his own press. He started to see himself not as a criminal who had avoided prosecution, but as a successful businessman who was being unfairly targeted by law enforcement. This change in how he saw himself made him careless in ways that would prove deadly to his empire. In the months following the article's publication, Nicky's behavior became increasingly reckless. He gave more interviews to other publications, showed up at high-profile public events, and even thought about writing an autobiography. He seemed to have forgotten that his power was built on being able to operate in the shadows, and that being famous and being a successful criminal just don't go together in a society governed by law. By 1977, the council had grown into one of the most advanced criminal organizations in American history. It operated with a level of professionalism and efficiency that rivaled legal corporations. Understanding how the council worked at its best gives us insight into both Nicky Barnes's genius as an organizer and the factors that would eventually lead to his downfall. The organization structure was shaped like a pyramid, with Nicky at the top and hundreds of street-level dealers at the bottom. But unlike traditional criminal setups, the council used multiple layers of protection that kept high-level members from direct involvement in day-to-day operations. Nicky rarely handled drugs or money directly, instead focusing on planning strategy, managing relationships, and overseeing the organization. The supply chain started with connections to international drug traffickers, mainly Italian-American crime families who brought in heroin from Turkey and Southeast Asia. The council bought drugs in large amounts, often 100 kilograms or more at a time, which let them negotiate better prices and make sure they always had supply. These purchases were paid for through a sophisticated banking system that involved multiple legal businesses and accounts in other countries. Once they got the drugs, they were processed in a network of safe houses located throughout New York and New Jersey. These places employed professional chemists who tested purity levels, mixed the product to the right strengths, and packaged it for distribution. The council kept strict quality standards with each batch tested and graded before release to make sure it was consistent and safe. This quality control was completely new in an industry where mixing in other stuff and inconsistent purity were common problems. Distribution was handled through a cell-based structure that minimized risk while maximizing efficiency. Street-level dealers bought their supply from middle managers who had no direct contact with council members. These middle managers, in turn, bought from regional distributors who got their supplies from council-controlled warehouses. This structure meant that if any level of the organization was compromised, the damage could be contained without threatening higher levels. The council also pioneered sophisticated money cleaning techniques that let them turn drug profits into legal assets. They bought numerous businesses, including restaurants, auto dealerships, dry cleaners, and record companies. These businesses were operated professionally and often became genuinely profitable, giving council members legal sources of income and respectability in the community. Record keeping was another area where the council went beyond typical criminal organizations. Despite the obvious risks involved in keeping detailed records, Nicky insisted on professional bookkeeping that tracked inventory, sales, expenses, and profits with the precision of a Fortune 500 company. These records let council members spot trends, make operations run better, and plan for growth. They also provided evidence that would later be devastating in court. The organization's total income at its peak was estimated at $1 million per week, with profits of about 60 to 70% after expenses. These numbers made the council one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in American history, generating more money than many legal businesses listed on the New York Stock Exchange. The council's control of New York's drug trade was not achieved without competition, and keeping that control required constant watching, strategic thinking, and occasional violence. By the mid-1970s, Nicky Barnes and the council controlled about 60% of heroin distribution in Harlem and significant portions of the trade in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens. This level of market control had never been seen before for a black criminal organization and represented a fundamental shift in the power balance of New York's underworld. The competition came from multiple sources, each requiring different strategies to handle. Traditional Italian-American crime families continued to run their own distribution networks, though they generally focused on different customer bases and avoided direct confrontation with the council. Independent dealers and smaller organizations posed a constant threat, often trying to push into council territory or undercut council prices. Most significantly, other large-scale black criminal organizations, particularly Frank Lucas's operation, represented serious competitive threats that required careful management. Frank Lucas, who operated mainly out of the Bronx and had direct connections to suppliers in Southeast Asia, was perhaps the council's toughest competitor. Lucas's organization was built around family relationships rather than business partnerships, which gave it different strengths and weaknesses compared to the council. The competition between Barnes and Lucas became one of the defining features of New York's drug trade in the 1970s. Each organization tried to outdo the other in terms of supply sources, distribution networks, and political connections. The council's approach to competition was sophisticated and had many angles. Rather than relying mainly on violence, they used business strategies that included price competition, quality differences, customer service, and territorial agreements. When violence was necessary, it was used strategically and professionally, often through middlemen who could not be directly connected to council leadership. One of the council's most effective competitive strategies was their cultivation of relationships with crooked law enforcement officials. By making regular payments to police officers, detectives, and even some federal agents, the council was often able to direct law enforcement attention toward their competitors while protecting their own operations. This corruption network was extensive and carefully managed, with different council members responsible for maintaining relationships with different law enforcement agencies. The council also used legal business fronts to gain competitive advantages. Their restaurants and nightclubs served as meeting places where business could be conducted in relatively safe environments. Their auto dealerships gave them access to vehicles that could be modified for drug transportation. Their record company gave them connections to musicians and entertainers who could provide cover for travel and meetings. Maybe most importantly, the council's reputation for professionalism and reliability gave them competitive advantages that couldn't be matched by more traditional criminal organizations. Customers knew that council products would be of consistent quality, that transactions would be conducted professionally, and that problems would be resolved fairly. This reputation allowed the council to charge premium prices and keep customer loyalty even when competitors offered lower prices. The success of the council came at an enormous cost to the Harlem community that had produced Nicky Barnes and provided the foundation for his empire. By the mid-1970s, heroin addiction had reached epidemic levels in Harlem. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed by the drug trade that had made Nicky and his associates wealthy beyond imagination. The numbers were staggering. Harlem's heroin addiction rate was estimated to be 10 times the national average, with some blocks having addiction rates exceeding 25% of the adult population. Emergency rooms throughout the area were overwhelmed with overdose cases, and the infant death rate in Harlem exceeded that of many developing countries due to the number of babies born to addicted mothers. The social fabric of the community was torn apart by the drug trade. Families were broken as breadwinners became addicts and children were abandoned or neglected. Crime rates shot up as addicts committed robberies, burglaries, and other crimes to pay for their habits. Educational achievement plummeted as young people dropped out of school to join the drug trade or were distracted by the chaos in their homes and neighborhoods. The economic impact was equally devastating. Legal businesses fled the area, unable to operate safely or profitably in an environment dominated by drug trafficking. Property values collapsed, creating a cycle of urban decay that would last for decades. The tax base eroded, leading to reduced city services and further deterioration of living conditions. Yet Nicky Barnes and other council members often portrayed themselves as community leaders and helpers. They made donations to local organizations, sponsored community events, and provided financial help to families in need. Nicky, in particular, was known for his generosity during holidays, often giving expensive gifts to children in his old neighborhood and paying for big community celebrations. This contradiction between their role in destroying the community and their image as community leaders showed the complex psychology of successful criminals who come from poor backgrounds. Nicky genuinely believed that he was providing opportunities for economic advancement to people who had been denied access to legal success. He saw the council as creating jobs and generating wealth in a community that had been abandoned by legal businesses and government programs. The reality, however, was that the council's success was built on using and destroying the very community that had produced it. For every person who found employment or financial benefit through the council's operations, dozens more were victimized by addiction, violence, or economic disruption. The wealth that flowed through the council's operations left the community almost immediately, invested in luxury goods, real estate, and businesses located far from Harlem. The most tragic part of this situation was that many community members, particularly young people, saw Nicky Barnes and other council members as role models and proof that success was possible. The flashy lifestyle, expensive clothes, and luxury cars were visible symbols of achievement in a community where such symbols were rare. This created a generation of young people who saw drug trafficking not as a social problem, but as a career opportunity. By 1976, Nicky Barnes had become the most wanted drug dealer in America. Yet he continued to operate with seeming freedom, attending public events, giving interviews, and showing off his wealth in ways that seemed to mock law enforcement's inability to prosecute him successfully. This situation created enormous frustration within federal and local law enforcement agencies, which had devoted huge resources to investigating the council without getting significant results. The problem was not lack of knowledge about the council's activities. Law enforcement agencies had extensive information about the organization's structure, operations, and leadership. The FBI had identified most council members, mapped their territories, and documented many of their criminal activities. The Drug Enforcement Administration had conducted numerous investigations and had informants within lower levels of the organization. Local police departments had arrested hundreds of street-level dealers associated with the council. The challenge was turning knowledge into cases they could win in court. The council's sophisticated structure, with its multiple layers of protection and separated operations, made it extremely difficult to connect high-level members to specific criminal activities. Nicky Barnes, in particular, was protected from direct involvement in drug transactions, violence, or money handling, making it nearly impossible to build cases based on traditional investigation methods. The council's corruption network also posed significant challenges for law enforcement, with sources inside police departments, federal agencies, and even prosecutors' offices. The council often learned about investigations before they could be finished. Surveillance operations were compromised, informants were identified and eliminated, and evidence was destroyed before it could be seized. Traditional investigation methods proved inadequate against an organization as sophisticated as the council. Surveillance was often ineffective because council members used counter-surveillance techniques and frequently changed their routines and meeting locations. Wiretaps were of limited value because council members used code words and encrypted communications. Undercover operations were nearly impossible because the council was extremely suspicious of new faces and required extensive background checks for anyone seeking to do business with them. The frustration was made worse by the fact that Nicky Barnes seemed to take pleasure in his ability to avoid prosecution. His media appearances and public statements often contained thinly veiled references to his criminal activities and his belief that he was untouchable. Law enforcement officials found themselves in the humiliating position of being unable to prosecute someone who was openly admitting to criminal activity. This situation created pressure at the highest levels of government. President Carter had made drug enforcement a priority, and the inability to prosecute such a high-profile drug dealer was seen as a failure of federal law enforcement. Congressional hearings were held to investigate the situation, and more resources were allocated to target the council specifically. The breakthrough would eventually come through the development of new investigation techniques, particularly the use of long-term surveillance operations and the cultivation of high-level informants within the council itself. But in 1976, as Nicky Barnes reached the peak of his power and influence, it seemed that he might indeed be untouchable, protected by a combination of organizational sophistication, political corruption, and his own strategic brilliance. The seeds of the council's destruction were planted at the moment of its greatest success. The New York Times Magazine cover story that had made Nicky Barnes a national celebrity also marked the beginning of the end for his criminal empire. The article attracted levels of attention that even Nicky's sophisticated organization could not handle, and it exposed internal tensions that would eventually tear the council apart from within. The first signs of trouble came in the form of increased law enforcement pressure. The Times article had embarrassed federal authorities. particularly the Drug Enforcement Administration, which found itself in the humiliating position of being unable to prosecute someone who was openly discussing his criminal activities in the national media. In response, the D created a special task force dedicated exclusively to investigating the council with resources and authority that exceeded anything previously devoted to a single drug trafficking organization. This task force, code-named Operation Mr. Untouchable, was led by Special Agent Robert Lacey, a veteran investigator with extensive experience in organized crime cases. Lacey put together a team of experienced agents and prosecutors who were given broad authority to investigate the council using any legal means necessary. The operation was given access to sophisticated surveillance equipment, unlimited overtime budgets, and the authority to offer substantial plea deals to potential informants. But external pressure was only part of the council's problem. The real threat came from within, as the success and fame that had made the organization powerful also created internal tensions that proved impossible to manage. The most serious issue was the growing resentment among council members toward Nicky's increasingly unpredictable behavior and his apparent belief that he was immune from the consequences of his actions. Several council members had opposed Nicky's decision to cooperate with the Times article, arguing that it would bring unnecessary attention to their operations. When their predictions proved correct, these members began to question Nicky's judgment and leadership. For the first time in the council's history, there were serious discussions about replacing Nicky as the organization's leader. The situation was complicated by money disputes that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. As law enforcement pressure increased and profits declined, council members began to accuse each other of holding back money and not contributing their fair share to the organization's defense fund. Trust, which had been the foundation of the council's success, began to break down as members became suspicious of each other's motives and loyalty. Personal relationships also contributed to the growing instability. Nicky's romantic involvement with multiple women created jealousies and conflicts that spilled over into business relationships. Several council members became involved in disputes over women, money, and territory that would have been unthinkable during the organization's early years, when discipline and professionalism had been most important. Perhaps most dangerously, success had made many council members careless about security procedures. The careful precautions that had protected the organization during its rise were increasingly ignored as members became confident in their ability to avoid prosecution. Meetings were held in regular locations, communications became less secret, and new members were recruited without the extensive background checks that had previously been standard procedure. As 1977 went on, Operation Mr. Untouchable began to show results that exceeded the expectations of even its most hopeful organizers. The Special Task Force had put in place a complete strategy that attacked the council from multiple directions at the same time, using techniques that the organization had never faced before and could not effectively counter. The centerpiece of the investigation was an extensive surveillance operation that used more than 50 agents working in rotating shifts to maintain 24-hour coverage of key council members. Unlike previous surveillance efforts, which had been irregular and easily detected, this operation was constant and professionally executed using the latest technology and techniques developed for intelligence operations. The surveillance revealed patterns of behavior and activity that gave investigators their first complete understanding of how the council actually operated. Agents were able to identify meeting locations, document relationships between members, and track the flow of drugs and money through the organization. Most importantly, the surveillance identified weak spots that could be used to develop informants and build cases they could win in court. The task force also put in place a financial investigation that had never been done before in drug cases. Working with the Internal Revenue Service and banking regulators, investigators began tracking the flow of money through the council's legal businesses and identifying assets that could be taken away. This approach was completely new because it focused on the profits of drug trafficking rather than just the trafficking itself, creating the possibility of prosecuting council members for tax evasion and money laundering even if direct drug charges could not be proven. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation began to have success in developing informants within the council itself. The combination of intensified law enforcement pressure and internal conflicts within the organization created opportunities to recruit sources who had never been available before. The first major breakthrough came when Wallace Rice, one of the original council members, was arrested on separate charges and agreed to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. Rice's cooperation gave investigators detailed information about the council's structure, operations, and leadership that would have been impossible to get through surveillance alone. He identified safe houses, revealed security procedures, and explained the organization's decision-making processes. Most importantly, he provided information that allowed investigators to approach other potential informants with offers they could not refuse. The mental pressure on council members was enormous. The constant surveillance made normal operations impossible, while the financial investigation threatened their accumulated wealth in legal businesses. Several members began to think about cooperating with law enforcement as a way to protect themselves and their families from prosecution and financial ruin. The investigation also benefited from better coordination between different law enforcement agencies. Unlike previous efforts, which had been held back by arguments over who was in charge and poor communication, Operation Mr. Untouchable brought together federal, state, and local agencies under one command. This coordination allowed investigators to share information, coordinate activities, and present a united front that the council could not manipulate through corruption or political influence. The winter of 1977 to 1978 marked the beginning of the council's final collapse. The combination of outside pressure and inside conflicts created a series of betrayals that would destroy the organization from within. The loyalty that had been the council's greatest strength became its biggest weakness as members began to prioritize their own survival over the good of the organization. The first major betrayal came from Frank James, who ran operations in the Bronx and had been one of Nicky's most trusted partners. James had been arrested on federal drug charges and faced the possibility of life in prison under new mandatory sentencing rules. Rather than keep quiet and rely on the council's resources for his defense, James chose to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. James's cooperation was devastating because of his detailed knowledge of the council's operations and his access to high-level information. He gave investigators organizational charts, financial records, and recorded conversations, showed the inner workings of the organization in unprecedented detail. More importantly, his cooperation encouraged other council members to think about similar deals before they too were arrested and prosecuted. The second major betrayal came from an unexpected source, Nicky's own girlfriend, Thelma Grant. Grant had been arrested on money laundering charges related to her role in managing some of the council's legal businesses. Facing serious prison time and financial ruin, she agreed to cooperate with federal authorities and wear recording devices during her conversations with Nicky and other council members. Grant's recordings were particularly damaging because they captured Nicky speaking honestly about the council's operations, his relationships with other criminal organizations, and his strategies for avoiding prosecution. These recordings gave prosecutors direct evidence of Nicky's leadership role in the organization and his involvement in specific criminal activities that had previously been impossible to prove. The betrayals created an atmosphere of suspicion within the council that made normal operations impossible. Members became suspicious of each other. Communications broke down, and the organizational discipline that had been the foundation of their success completely fell apart. Meetings became rare and tense, affairs where members spent more time accusing each other of disloyalty than conducting business. Nicky himself contributed to the worsening situation through increasingly unpredictable behavior that showed his growing suspicion and desperation. He began carrying weapons, changing his daily routines unpredictably, and avoiding contact with other council members. His public appearances became rare, and when he did show up in public, he was often accompanied by armed bodyguards who made him look more like a hunted criminal than a successful businessman. The money pressures also got worse as the council's operations were disrupted by arrests and investigations. Income dropped dramatically, while expenses increased due to legal fees, security costs, and the need to pay higher prices for drugs as suppliers became reluctant to do business with an organization under such intense scrutiny. Several council members began to pull their own money out of joint operations, speeding up the organization's financial collapse. By late 1977, Operation Nister, Untouchable had gathered enough evidence to begin the process of taking apart the council. Through a series of coordinated arrests and prosecutions, the investigation had identified more than 200 people associated with the organization, documented millions of dollars in drug transactions, and accumulated thousands of hours of surveillance evidence and recorded conversations. The strategy was to begin with arrests of lower-level members and work up the organizational ladder, using each arrest to get more cooperation and evidence against higher-level targets. This approach was designed to create maximum pressure on the council's leadership while building the strongest possible cases against the organization's top figures. The first wave of arrests began in November 1977 and targeted middle management and street-level dealers throughout the council's territories. These arrests were carefully coordinated to happen at the same time, preventing warnings from reaching higher levels of the organization. Within a single week, more than 50 council associates were arrested on federal drug trafficking charges. These arrests had an immediate impact on the council's operations. Distribution networks were disrupted. Safe houses were compromised and communication systems were shut down. More importantly, the arrests created additional pressure on council members who realized that their own arrests were inevitable unless they took action to protect themselves. The second wave of arrests began in December 1977 and targeted council members and other high-level figures in the organization. These arrests were supported by detailed evidence gathered through surveillance, financial investigations, and cooperating witnesses. Unlike the street-level arrests, these cases were built to make sure of convictions, even if the defendants chose not to cooperate with authorities. Guy Fisher was arrested first, charged with federal drug trafficking and money laundering crimes that carried potential life sentences. His arrest was followed within days by the arrests of Ismail Muhammad, Thomas Foreman, and several other council members. Each arrest was accompanied by seizures of cash, drugs, weapons, and other evidence that further strengthened the government's cases. The arrests created panic among the remaining council members, who realized that their organization had been completely penetrated by law enforcement. Several members fled New York, hoping to start new operations in other cities or simply to avoid arrest. Others began reaching out to lawyers to explore the possibility of cooperation agreements with federal authorities. Nicky himself remained free, but he was under constant surveillance and knew that his arrest was coming soon. The mental pressure was enormous as he watched his empire crumble and his associates either flee or betray him. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely powerless to control events or protect himself through the methods that had served him so well in the past. The end came on a cold January morning in 1978, when Nicky Barnes was arrested at his apartment on the Upper West Side by a team of federal agents who had been waiting for the perfect moment to take him into custody. The arrest was anticlimactic compared to the dramatic raids that had characterized other phases of Operation Mr. Untouchable. There was no resistance, no chase scene, no shootout. Nicky simply opened his door to find armed agents with a warrant for his arrest. The timing of the arrest was carefully chosen. Investigators had waited until they had overwhelming evidence against Nicky and until most of his associates had already been arrested or had fled. They wanted to make sure that his arrest would not trigger any violence or allow other council members to escape prosecution. The arrest was also timed to happen when Nicky was alone and had no opportunity to destroy evidence or communicate with associates. The charges against Nicky were complete and devastating. He was charged with federal drug trafficking crimes that carried mandatory life sentences, money laundering charges that could result in all his assets being taken away, and racketeering charges under the Organized Crime Control Act that allowed prosecutors to target his entire criminal enterprise. The official document listed specific drug transactions, documented his leadership role in the council, and outlined the scope of his criminal activities over more than a decade. The arrest marked the effective end of the council as a working criminal organization, with Nicky in custody and most other members either arrested, fled, or cooperating with authorities. The organization that had controlled New York's drug trade for more than a decade simply stopped existing. The sophisticated structure that Nicky had built to make sure the organization survived proved inadequate when faced with constant law, enforcement pressure, and internal betrayal. The media coverage of Nicky's arrest was extensive, with newspaper headlines announcing the fall of Mr. Untouchable and television reports detailing the scope of his criminal empire. The same media attention that had fed Nicky's ego during his rise now documented his downfall, creating a sharp contrast between the confident criminal celebrity of 1977 and the handcuffed defendant of 1978. For law enforcement officials, Nicky's arrest represented the successful conclusion of one of the most complex and resource-intensive drug investigations in American history. Operation Mr. Untouchable had not only taken apart the council, but had also shown new techniques and strategies that would be used against other criminal organizations in the future. But for Nicky himself, the arrest was not just the end of his criminal career, but the beginning of a personal journey that would challenge everything he believed about loyalty, success, and survival. Sitting in his jail cell waiting for trial, he faced the reality that the empire he had built was gone. His associates had abandoned or betrayed him, and his own future depended on decisions that would define the rest of his life. The trial of Nicky Barnes began in August 1978 in federal court in Manhattan, attracting national media attention and setting new standards for the prosecution of large-scale drug trafficking organizations. The case, formerly known as United States v. Barnes et al., would last for months and feature testimony from dozens of witnesses, including several high-ranking members of the council who had agreed to cooperate with the government. The prosecution team, led by Assistant United States Attorney Robert Fisk, had prepared carefully for the trial. They had organized thousands of pieces of evidence, including surveillance photographs, financial records, wiretap recordings, and physical evidence seized during raids. The case they presented painted a complete picture of the council as a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had generated millions of dollars in profits, while devastating communities throughout New York. The government's strategy was to show Nicky's leadership role in the council through a combination of documentary evidence and witness testimony. They showed organizational charts that placed Nicky at the top of the criminal structure, financial records that traced money flows through his legal businesses, and surveillance evidence that documented his meetings with other council members and criminal associates. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of former council members who had agreed to cooperate with the government. Frank James provided detailed testimony about the council's structure and operations, describing Nicky's role in making strategic decisions and settling arguments. Wallace Rice testified about specific drug transactions and money laundering activities. Most devastatingly, Thelma Grant played recorded conversations in which Nicky discussed council operations in his own words. The defense team, led by attorney David Breitbart, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against Nicky was overwhelming, and the prosecution had multiple cooperating witnesses who could testify about his criminal activities from personal knowledge. The defense strategy focused on challenging the believability of cooperating witnesses and arguing that Nicky was being prosecuted for his lifestyle and reputation rather than for specific criminal acts. Breitbart argued that the cooperating witnesses were unreliable because they had received large benefits in exchange for their testimony. He pointed out that several witnesses had faced life sentences before agreeing to cooperate, and suggested that they would say whatever prosecutors wanted to hear in order to reduce their own punishment. He also argued that much of the evidence was circumstantial, and that Nicky's wealth could have come from legal business activities. The defense faced several problems they could not overcome. The sheer amount of evidence made it difficult to challenge every piece of the government's case. The consistency of testimony from multiple cooperating witnesses made it difficult to argue that they were all lying. Most importantly, the recorded conversations gave direct evidence of Nicky's involvement in criminal activities in his own voice. The trial also featured testimony about the council's impact on New York's communities with law, enforcement officials and community leaders describing the shoal, devastation caused by the organization's drug trafficking activities. These witnesses testified about increased crime rates, destroyed families, and economic decline in neighborhoods where the council had operated. This testimony was designed to show the jury the human cost of Nicky's criminal enterprise. On November 19, 1978, after thinking about it for less than 2 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts against Nicky Barnes. The verdict was not surprising given the strength of the evidence, but it marked the official end of one of the most powerful criminal careers in American history. A man who had once called himself Mr. Untouchable had been touched by the law in the most final way possible. The guilty verdict covered multiple federal charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and racketeering, under federal sentencing rules in effect at the time. These convictions carried mandatory sentences that would make sure Nicky would spend the rest of his life in prison. The judge had no choice to reduce the sentence, regardless of any factors that might argue for mercy or possibility of change. Judge Henry Worker, who presided over the trial, scheduled sentencing for December 1978. In the weeks leading up to sentencing, Nicky's lawyers filed numerous requests, seeking to reduce the charges or asking for mercy based on Nicky's cooperation during the trial and his potential value as a witness in other cases. However, these requests were mostly just procedures, since everyone involved understood that the sentences were already decided by federal rules. The sentencing hearing was attended by dozens of law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and reporters who wanted to witness the final chapter in the story of New York's most famous drug dealer. Nicky himself appeared calm and accepting of his fate. Having had months to come to terms with the reality of his situation, Judge Worker sentenced Nicky Barnes to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for the money laundering and racketeering convictions. The total sentence effectively made sure that Nicky would never again be free, regardless of his age or health condition. The judge also ordered all assets that could be traced to Nicky's criminal activities to be taken away, including his businesses, real estate, vehicles, and personal possessions. In addition to the life sentence, Judge Worker delivered a statement that showed the court's view of Nicky's crimes and their impact on society. He described the council as one of the most destructive criminal organizations in the history of New York, and characterized Nicky as a criminal whose pursuit of wealth and power came at the expense of countless innocent victims. The judge noted that the sentence was appropriate, not just as punishment for past crimes, but as a warning to others who might think about following a similar path. The sentencing marked the end of the largest and most successful prosecution of a drug trafficking organization in American history up to that time. Operation Mr. Untouchable had resulted in more than 200 arrests, the seizure of millions of dollars in assets, and the complete destruction of an organization that had controlled New York's drug trade for more than a decade. For law enforcement officials, the case represented a turning point that showed the effectiveness of coordinated, long-term investigations against sophisticated criminal organizations. The techniques developed during Operation Mr. Untouchable would be used as models for future investigations against other criminal enterprises. But for Nicky Barnes, sitting in his federal prison cell, the conviction and sentence represented the complete destruction of everything he had worked to achieve. The empire was gone, the money was taken, the associates had either fled or betrayed him, and his future held nothing but decades of imprisonment. It was in this situation that he would make the decision that would define the final chapter of his life and earn him a different kind of fame. The Federal Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where Nicky Barnes began serving his life sentence, was a sharp contrast to the luxury he had known at the height of his power. The small windowless cell, the institutional food, and the rigid schedule were designed to strip away every trace of the identity he had built as MR. Untouchable, but it was not the physical discomfort that affected Nicky most deeply. It was the complete powerlessness and the realization that everything he had built had been temporary. In the first months of his imprisonment, Nicky kept the tough attitude that had characterized his public image. He refused interviews, kept quiet about council operations, and carried himself with the dignity expected of a high-level criminal who understood and accepted the consequences of his choices. Other prisoners regarded him with a mixture of respect and curiosity, recognizing him as someone who had achieved legendary status in the criminal world. But as months turned into years, the reality of his situation began to weigh heavily on him. Unlike other high-profile criminals who could keep influence and connections from prison, Nicky found himself increasingly alone. The council had completely broken up. His former associates had either fled the country or were serving their own prison sentences, and his legal businesses had been seized and sold by federal authorities. Perhaps most disturbing was his growing awareness of how completely he had been abandoned by those he had once considered loyal partners. He learned that several council members had not only cooperated with authorities, but had actively worked to make sure he was convicted in order to protect themselves. Former friends and partners refused to accept his phone calls or respond to his letters. Women who had enjoyed his generosity during his time of wealth and power showed no interest in keeping in touch with a man who could no longer give them material benefits. This isolation was made worse by his treatment from other prisoners, many of whom had been affected by the drug trade that had made him wealthy. While some prisoners respected his former status, others viewed him as someone who had profited from the destruction of their communities and families. Several confrontations happened during his early years in prison, forcing Nicky to request protective custody for his own safety. The protective custody environment was even more restrictive than the general prison population, with limited social contact and fewer privileges. Nicky spent 22 hours per day in his cell with minimal human interaction and nothing to occupy his time except books and his own thoughts. This forced isolation created an opportunity for thinking that had been impossible during his active criminal career. During these long hours of solitude, Nicky began to face aspects of his life and character that he had previously avoided examining. He thought about the communities he had helped destroy, the families torn apart by addiction, and the young people who had followed his example into criminal careers that ended in prison or death. For the first time, he began to question whether his pursuit of wealth and power had been worth the cost to others and to himself. By 1981, 3 years into his life sentence, Nicky Barnes had reached a mental breaking point that would lead to one of the most controversial decisions in the history of American organized crime. The combination of isolation, abandonment by former associates, and his growing understanding of the pointlessness of his situation had created conditions that made cooperation with federal authorities seem like his only remaining option. The immediate reason for his decision was a series of revelations about the behavior of his former counsel associates. Through prison contacts and occasional news reports, Nicky learned that several of his former partners had not only cooperated with authorities, but had actively worked to increase his sentence while negotiating better deals for themselves. Most upsetting was the discovery that some council members had been keeping up relationships with his former girlfriends and were openly benefiting from assets that should have been kept for his family. Frank James, who had been one of the first council members to cooperate, had received a sentence of only 10 years in exchange for his testimony against Nicky. Guy Fisher had worked out a deal that allowed him to keep certain assets that had been accumulated through council operations. Several other former associates had avoided prosecution entirely by giving information against Nicky while hiding their own involvement in council activities. This betrayal challenged every assumption Nicky had made about loyalty, honor, and the unwritten rules that governed criminal behavior. He had kept quiet based on the belief that this would protect his associates and that they would return this loyalty. The discovery that they had abandoned these principles while expecting him to keep them created a deep sense of betrayal and injustice. The realization that his silence was protecting people who had betrayed him while providing no benefit to himself or his family forced Nicky to rethink his options. He began to see cooperation not as a violation of criminal codes, but as a reasonable response to a situation where others had already violated those codes. If loyalty was not returned, then the obligation to keep quiet no longer applied. The practical benefits of cooperation were also convincing. Federal prosecutors had indicated that major cooperation could result in sentence reduction and eventual release from prison. Given his age and health, cooperation might represent his only opportunity to spend his final years as a free man. The alternative was certain death in prison, with no benefit to anyone except those who had betrayed him. In late 1981, through his lawyer, Nicky Barnes contacted federal prosecutors to explore the possibility of a cooperation agreement. These initial discussions were tentative and unofficial, designed to figure out what information he could provide and what benefits he might receive in return. The discussions showed that his knowledge of criminal activities extended far beyond the council to include other major drug trafficking organizations, corrupt officials, and international smuggling networks. The formal cooperation agreement between Nicky Barnes and federal authorities was signed in March 1982, marking his change from one of America's most powerful drug dealers into one of its most valuable criminal informants. The agreement required him to provide complete and truthful information about all criminal activities he had knowledge of, to testify in court proceedings when requested, and to go through extensive questioning sessions with law enforcement agents. In exchange, federal prosecutors agreed to recommend substantial sentence reductions based on the value of his cooperation. The agreement did not guarantee his release from prison, but it created the possibility that his life sentence could be reduced to a term that would allow his eventual freedom more immediately. The agreement provided for his transfer to a more secure facility where he would be protected from revenge by other criminals. The questioning process was extensive and detailed, lasting for more than 2 years and covering every aspect of Nicky's criminal career. Federal agents interviewed him for hundreds of hours, asking detailed questions about the council's operations, its relationships with other criminal organizations, and the corruption networks that had protected it from law enforcement. The information he provided was checked against existing information and used to generate leads for ongoing investigations. Nicky's cooperation proved to be extremely valuable to law enforcement agencies. His information led to the prosecution of more than 50 additional criminals, including several high-ranking members of Italian-American crime families who had supplied drugs to the council. He gave detailed information about corruption within police departments and federal agencies, leading to the prosecution of more than a dozen law enforcement officials. His knowledge of money laundering techniques and international drug trafficking networks proved useful in investigations throughout the United States and internationally. Perhaps most importantly, Nicky's cooperation gave law enforcement unprecedented understanding of the structure and operations of sophisticated criminal organizations. His detailed explanations of how the council had been organized and managed became a model for understanding and investigating other criminal enterprises. The information he provided was added to training programs for law enforcement agents and prosecutors throughout the country. The cooperation also had personal benefits for Nicky. He was moved to a federal witness protection facility, where he had more privileges and better living conditions than he had experienced in regular prison. He was able to keep in touch with family members and was given opportunities for education and job training. Most importantly, the cooperation gave him a sense of purpose and the possibility of eventual redemption. But cooperation also came with significant risks and mental costs. Nicky was now marked for death by numerous criminal organizations whose members he had exposed through his testimony. He would spend the rest of his life under the protection of federal authorities, unable to live openly or keep normal relationships. The cooperation also required him to face and publicly acknowledge the harm his criminal activities had caused, a process that was emotionally difficult and mentally challenging. Nicky Barnes's first major court appearance as a cooperating witness came in 1984 when he testified in the trial of several former council members who had avoided prosecution during the original investigation. His appearance in court as a government witness was shocking to the criminal community and created a media sensation that matched his original arrest and trial. The decision to testify against his former associates was perhaps the most difficult part of Nicky's cooperation agreement. These were men who had worked with him for years, who had shared the risks and rewards of building the council, and who had once been bound by shared loyalty and mutual dependence. Testifying against them represented a complete rejection of the codes that had governed his entire adult life. But Nicky's view of these relationships had been fundamentally changed by his discovery of their earlier betrayals. He had learned that several of the men he was now testifying against had themselves cooperated with authorities during the original investigation, providing information that had helped convict him while hiding their own involvement. Others had actively worked to make sure he was prosecuted while working out their own deals with federal authorities. His testimony was detailed and devastating. He described the structure and operations of the NIT, counseled with the authority of someone who had created and managed the organization. He explained how decisions were made, how profits were divided, and how the organization had protected itself from law enforcement. He identified specific crimes committed by individual council members and explained their roles in the overall criminal enterprise. The testimony was particularly effective because of Nicky's believability and detailed knowledge. Unlike many cooperating witnesses who could only testify about specific events or limited aspects of criminal operations, Nicky could provide complete testimony about every aspect of the council's activities. His military background and natural intelligence made him an articulate and convincing witness who could explain complex criminal operations in terms that judges and juries could easily understand. The trials resulted in numerous convictions and long prison sentences for former council members who had previously escaped prosecution. Guy Fisher was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Ismail Muhammad received a sentence of 30 years. Several other former associates received substantial sentences that effectively ended their criminal careers. But the testimony also had wider implications beyond the specific prosecutions it enabled. Nicky's willingness to testify against former associates sent a message throughout the criminal community that traditional codes of silence could no longer be relied upon to protect criminal organizations. His example encouraged other criminals to think about cooperating with authorities, contributing to a fundamental change in how criminal cases were investigated and prosecuted. The personal cost of testifying was enormous. Nicky was now viewed as a traitor by the criminal community that had once respected him. Multiple contracts were placed on his life, forcing him to live under constant protection. His reputation as MR, Untouchable, was replaced by the shame of being an informant, a change that was both humiliating and dangerous. In 1987, after more than 5 years of cooperating with federal authorities, Nicky Barnes was quietly released from federal prison and entered the federal witness protection program under a new identity. His sentence had been reduced to time already served based on his extensive cooperation, and he was given the opportunity to begin a new life under federal protection. The move to life in witness protection was challenging in ways that Nicky had not expected. After decades of living as a high-profile criminal celebrity, he was now required to live anonymously, avoiding any behavior or activity that might reveal his identity or location. He was given a new name, a made-up personal history, and documentation that supported his new identity. He was moved to a small city in the Midwest, far from the New York environment, where he had built his reputation and criminal empire. The new identity required him to give up everything that had defined his previous life. He could no longer dress in the expensive suits and jewelry that had been his trademark. He could not drive luxury cars or go to fancy restaurants. He was required to live modestly, work in legal employment, and avoid any contact with his former associates or family members. The change was so complete that the man who had once been featured on the cover of national magazines now lived in complete anonymity. At first, adjusting was extremely difficult. After years of commanding respect and wielding power, Nicky found it hard to accept the boring reality of ordinary life. He worked in a series of low-paying jobs, lived in modest apartments, and struggled to find meaning in a life stripped of the excitement and status he had once enjoyed. The contrast with his former lifestyle was sharp and often depressing. But gradually, Nicky began to find unexpected benefits in his new life. For the first time in decades, he could live without fear of arrest, violence, or betrayal. He could sleep peacefully without worrying about rivals, law enforcement raids, or murder attempts. He could form relationships based on genuine affection rather than money or criminal interests. The anonymity that at first felt like imprisonment eventually became a form of freedom. He could walk down the street without being recognized, could interact with people without them knowing his criminal past, and could make choices based on personal preference rather than strategic calculation. The simple pleasures of ordinary life, reading books, watching television, having normal conversations became sources of satisfaction that had been impossible during his criminal career. Perhaps most importantly, the new life gave opportunities for thinking and personal growth that had been impossible during his years as a criminal leader. Away from the pressures and temptations of his former environment, Nicky could honestly look at his life choices and their consequences. He could admit the harm his activities had caused and think about how he might use his remaining years in more positive ways. The later years of Nicky Barnes's life were marked by a process of reflection and attempted redemption that would have been impossible to imagine during his years as a criminal leader. Living under witness protection gave him the anonymity and safety necessary to honestly examine his life choices and their consequences, leading to a change that was both deep and very personal. In his new identity, Nicky began to face the reality of the harm his criminal activities had caused. Away from the justifications and excuses that had supported his criminal career, he could see clearly the devastating impact that the council's drug trafficking had had on communities throughout New York. He could see plainly how his pursuit of wealth and power had contributed to addiction, violence, and family destruction on a massive scale. This recognition led to what could only be described as a genuine change of heart. For the first time in his adult life, Nicky accepted full responsibility for his actions and their consequences. He admitted that his success had been built on using and destroying vulnerable people, and that no amount of charitable giving or community involvement could make up for the basic harm he had caused. The process of accepting responsibility was emotionally crushing, but also freeing. It freed him from the need to justify or excuse his past behavior and allowed him to focus on how he might use his remaining years more positively. He began to see his cooperation with law enforcement not just as a way to survive, but as a form of making amends that could prevent others from following his path or becoming victims of similar criminal enterprises. In the quiet anonymity of his new life, Nicky began to educate himself about the wider social and economic factors that had contributed to the drug epidemic he had helped fuel. He read extensively about addiction, urban poverty, and criminal justice policy. He studied the experiences of other communities that had been devastated by drug trafficking and learned about successful intervention and prevention programs. This education deepened his understanding of his own role in continuing cycles of poverty and violence that had affected generations of families in New York's urban communities. He came to understand that his success had not represented an escape from the problems of his environment, but rather their highest point, an intensification. The wealth and power he had accumulated had come at the expense of the very communities that had produced him. As he got older, Nicky also began to think about questions of legacy and meaning that had been unimportant during his criminal career. He wondered how he would be remembered and what lessons his life might offer to others. He recognized that his story could serve as either an inspiration for criminal behavior or a warning about its ultimate uselessness, depending on how it was told and understood. Despite the deep changes in his perspective, Nicky never lost his analytical intelligence or his understanding of human nature. He could see clearly how the same forces that had driven his own criminal career continued to operate in American society, creating new generations of criminals and victims. This understanding gave him insights that could be valuable in developing better approaches to crime prevention and criminal justice. However, his status as a protected witness severely limited his ability to share these insights publicly. He could not write books, give interviews, or participate in educational programs that might reveal his identity or location. His knowledge and experience, which could have been valuable resources for understanding and fighting organized crime, remained mostly locked away by the requirements of his protection. As Nicky Barnes entered his final years, he lived the quiet, anonymous life of an ordinary retired person in a small American city. His neighbors knew him as a polite, well-read man who kept to himself, but was always willing to help with small favors or engage in friendly conversation. They had no idea that the elderly man who tended his small garden and walked his dog each morning had once been one of the most powerful and feared criminals in American history. The contrast between his public image during his criminal career and his final years could not have been more sharp. The man who had once demanded attention and respect now valued privacy and anonymity above all else. The person who had lived surrounded by luxury and excitement now found happiness in simple pleasures and quiet routines. The individual who had wielded enormous power now exercised influence only through small acts of kindness and community involvement. Despite the deep changes in his situation and perspective, Nicky kept the intelligence and charm that had made him successful as a criminal leader. He became known in his community as someone who could be trusted with private information, who gave thoughtful advice, and who had an unusual understanding of human nature and motivation. Several younger men in the community sought him out as a mentor, though they never knew the source of his insights into life's challenges and opportunities. His health began to decline in his 70s. The stresses and excesses of his criminal career took their toll, and he developed diabetes, heart problems, and other conditions that required regular medical attention. But even in illness, he kept the dignity and calm acceptance that had characterized his response to imprisonment and cooperation with authorities. As death approached, Nicky spent increasing time thinking about his life and its meaning. He thought about the boy from Harlem who had dreamed of escaping poverty and achieving respect, and he wondered whether there had been other paths that could have led to legal success and genuine fulfillment. He considered the thousands of lives that had been affected by his criminal activities and hoped that his cooperation with law enforcement had provided some small amount of making amends for the harm he had caused. He also thought about the wider lessons his life might offer to others facing similar choices and circumstances. He understood that his story was both unique and representative. Unique in its scale and fame, but representative of the wider patterns of crime, poverty, and urban decay that continued to affect American cities. He hoped that somehow someday his experiences might be used to help others avoid the destructive path he had chosen. Nicky Barnes died peacefully in his sleep on June 18, 2012, at the age of 78. His death was noted only by a brief death notice in the local newspaper, which identified him by his fake name and mentioned his work as a community volunteer and his reputation as a kind and helpful neighbor. There was no mention of his criminal past or his role in one of the most significant drug-charging cases in American history. The anonymity of his death was exactly what federal authorities had intended. when they created his new identity more than 25 years earlier, but it also represented a fitting end to a life that had undergone a complete change from public fame to private redemption. The man who had once called himself Mr. Untouchable died as he had lived his final years, quietly, anonymously, and at peace with himself and his choices. The death of Nicky Barnes marked the end of one of the most remarkable criminal careers in American history, but it also created an opportunity to consider the wider meaning of his life and its lessons for understanding organized crime, criminal justice, and urban social problems. His story, from its beginnings in Depression-era Harlem to its end in anonymous suburban retirement, shines light on important patterns and dynamics that continue to influence American society at its most basic level. Nicky Barnes's life represents the twisting of the American dream by circumstances that made legal success extremely difficult to achieve. Born into poverty during the Great Depression, raised in a community where legal opportunities were scarce and unfair treatment was everywhere, he chose a path that promised quick advancement and material success. His criminal career can be understood as a twisted businesslike response to economic and social conditions that limited his access to normal forms of achievement. This way of looking at it does not excuse or justify his criminal activities, but it does provide context for understanding why intelligent and ambitious people sometimes choose destructive paths. Nicky's success as a criminal leader showed many of the same qualities: intelligence, charm, ability to organize, strategic thinking that could have made him successful in legal business under different circumstances. The sophistication of the council as a criminal organization also provides important insights into how organized crime changed in America. Unlike traditional crime families that were based on ethnic loyalty and family relationships, the council was organized around business principles and moving up based on merit. This structure made it more efficient and profitable than traditional criminal organizations, but also more open to the betrayals that ultimately destroyed it. The council's emphasis on professionalism, quality control, and customer service represented a new idea in criminal enterprise that has been widely copied by later drug trafficking organizations. The techniques Nicky developed for avoiding law enforcement detection, cleaning money, and keeping organizational discipline became standard practices throughout the criminal world. Perhaps most importantly, Nicky's eventual cooperation with law enforcement marked a turning point in American criminal justice. His willingness to testify against former associates broke traditional codes of silence and showed that even the most powerful criminals could be convinced to cooperate under the right circumstances. This precedent encouraged law enforcement agencies to develop more sophisticated strategies for finding informants and building cases against organized criminal enterprises. The investigation and prosecution of the council also set new models for law enforcement coordination and use of resources. Operation Mr. Untouchable showed the effectiveness of constant, well-funded investigations that brought together multiple agencies and areas of jurisdiction. The techniques developed during this investigation became standard practices for federal drug enforcement and organized crime investigations. From a social policy perspective, Nicky's story shows both the destructive impact of drug trafficking on urban communities and the complicated relationships between crime, poverty, and social unfairness. The council's operations helped destroy Harlem and other New York neighborhoods, creating cycles of addiction, violence, and economic decline that lasted long after the organization was taken apart. But Nicky's story also shows the possibility of redemption and change, even for individuals who have caused enormous harm. His cooperation with law enforcement and his apparently genuine regret for his criminal activities suggest that people are capable of basic change even late in life and after years of destructive behavior. To fully understand the meaning of Nicky Barnes's life and career, it is necessary to place his story within the wider context of American urban history, criminal justice policy, and social change during the second half of the 20th century. His rise and fall happened at the same time as it contributed to basic changes in American cities, law enforcement, and social attitudes toward crime and punishment. The conditions that shaped Nicky's early life in Harlem were products of wider historical forces that affected black communities throughout the United States. The Great Migration had brought millions of black people from the rural South to northern cities, creating crowded populations in urban neighborhoods that were often isolated by separation and unfair treatment. These communities faced limited economic opportunities, poor public services, and social problems that created fertile ground for alternative economies, including organized crime. The drug epidemic that provided the foundation for Nicky's criminal empire was itself a product of complicated international and domestic factors. The growth of heroin trafficking from Turkey and Southeast Asia, the disruption of traditional supply lines during the Vietnam War, and the social unrest of the 1960s all helped create conditions that made large-scale drug trafficking both possible and profitable. The rise of the council also happened at the same time as significant changes in law enforcement and criminal justice policy. The creation of the Drug Enforcement Administration in 1973, the passage of new federal drug laws with required minimum sentences, and the development of sophisticated investigation techniques all showed growing government commitment to fighting drug trafficking. The success of Operation Mr. Untouchable showed the effectiveness of these new approaches and encouraged their expansion. The social impact of organizations like the Council extended far beyond their direct criminal activities. The drug epidemic they helped fuel contributed to wider patterns of urban decay, family breakdown, and social disorganization that affected entire communities for decades. The violence connected with drug trafficking made many urban neighborhoods unsafe for residents and businesses, speeding up processes of economic decline and population loss. The wealth created by drug trafficking also created twisted economic rewards that affected entire communities. Young people growing up in neighborhoods dominated by drug trafficking often saw criminal activity as the most realistic path to economic success, creating cycles of recruitment and involvement that kept the drug trade going across generations. The eventual taking apart of the council and prosecution of its members represented a significant victory for law enforcement, but it did not solve the underlying social and economic problems that had made the organization possible. Other criminal enterprises quickly moved to fill the empty space left by the council's destruction, and the drug trade continued to change and adapt to law enforcement pressure. Nicky's decision to cooperate with authorities also showed wider changes in criminal culture and law enforcement strategy. The traditional codes of silence that had protected organized crime families for decades began to break down as criminals faced longer sentences and law enforcement offered more attractive cooperation agreements. This trend fundamentally changed how criminal organizations and investigations worked. As we reach the end of Nicky Barnes's remarkable story, we are left with lasting questions about crime, justice, redemption, and the nature of American society itself. His life raises basic issues that extend far beyond the specifics of his criminal career to touch on some of the most challenging problems facing America today. Perhaps the most basic question raised by Nicky's story is whether his criminal career was unavoidable given the circumstances of his birth and bringing, or whether different choices and opportunities might have led to a different result. This question goes to the heart of debates about free will, social forces, and personal responsibility that have implications far beyond criminal justice policy. The extraordinary sophistication of the Council as a criminal organization also raises questions about the relationship between intelligence, ambition, and moral choice. Nicky clearly had remarkable organizational and leadership abilities that could have been directed toward legal purposes under different circumstances. His success as a criminal leader shows that criminal behavior is not simply the result of limited intelligence or lack of ability, but can involve the same qualities that lead to success in legal activities. The destruction that the Council's activities caused in urban communities raises difficult questions about the relationship between individual choice and social responsibility. While Nicky and his associates were clearly responsible for their criminal activities, those activities took place within social and economic contexts that limited opportunities for legal success and created rewards for criminal behavior. The eventual cooperation of Nicky and other council members with law enforcement authorities raises questions about loyalty, betrayal, and the codes of conduct that govern both criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies. Nicky's decision to become an informant violated traditional criminal codes, but may have served the wider social interests by helping to take apart other criminal organizations and prevent future crimes. Perhaps most fundamentally, Nicky's apparent change during his final years raises questions about the possibility of redemption and the purposes of criminal justice. His cooperation with authorities, his apparently genuine regret for his criminal activities, and his quiet final years suggest that even individuals who have caused enormous harm are capable of change and growth. These questions have no easy answers, and different people will draw different conclusions from Nicky Barnes' story based on their own values, experiences, and beliefs about human nature and social policy. But the questions themselves are important because they force us to think more deeply about the root causes of crime, the effectiveness of our responses to it, and the possibilities for preventing future tragedies. In the years following Nicky Barnes' death, his story has become the subject of books, documentaries, and academic studies that have made his place certain in the records of American criminal history. The man who once called himself Mr. Untouchable has indeed achieved a form of immortality, though not the kind he originally wanted. His life has become a warning that is taught in criminal justice courses, mentioned in policy debates, and referred to in discussions about urban poverty and social unfairness. The techniques he developed for organizing and managing criminal enterprises are studied by law enforcement, agencies seeking to understand and fight today's criminal organizations. But perhaps the most important legacy of Nicky Barnes' life is not found in academic studies or law enforcement training programs, but in the communities that were affected by his criminal activities. In Harlem and other neighborhoods where the council operated, his story serves as a reminder of the destructive power of the drug trade and the importance of providing young people with legal opportunities for achievement and success. The rise and fall of Nicky Barnes represents more than just the life story of a single criminal. It is the story of a particular moment in American history when urban communities faced challenges never seen before, when traditional approaches to law enforcement proved inadequate, and when the pursuit of the American dream through illegal means reached its logical and destructive end. His change from powerful criminal leader to cooperating witness to anonymous retired person shows the possibility of change and redemption, even under the most difficult circumstances. But it also shows the enormous costs, both personal and social, of choosing criminal paths to success and recognition. As America continues to deal with issues of crime, poverty, and social unfairness, The story of Nicky Barnes remains relevant and instructive. It reminds us that criminal behavior often comes from deeper social problems that must be addressed to complete approaches that go beyond law enforcement. It shows the importance of providing legal opportunities for achievement and recognition to young people who might otherwise be attracted to criminal careers. Most importantly, it shows both the destructive potential of uncontrolled ambition separated from moral consideration and the redemptive power of accepting responsibility for one's actions and working to prevent others from repeating one's mistakes. The legend of Mr. Untouchable will last, but perhaps its greatest value lies not in celebrating criminal success, but in understanding its ultimate uselessness and the importance of building societies that offer genuine opportunities for legal achievement to all their members. Every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually faces its judgment. The true measure of a life is not the wealth accumulated or the power held, but the impact on others and the legacy left for future generations. In the end, Nicky Barnes' story is a uniquely American tale of ambition, success, failure, and redemption that continues to matter because it touches on basic questions about who we are as a society and what we value as human beings. His life reminds us that the pursuit of the American dream, when separated from moral considerations and social responsibility, can lead to outcomes that benefit no one and destroy much that is precious and cannot be replaced. The streets of Harlem, where young Loy Barnes once walked, still echo with the consequences of the choices he made and the empire he built. But they also whisper of possibilities for redemption, change, and the endless human capacity for both destruction and renewal. In that whisper, perhaps lies the most important lesson of all, that every ending can be a beginning. Every fall can lead to a rise, and every person, no matter how far they have fallen, keeps the possibility of choosing a better path. This is the complete story of Nicky Barnes. Criminal, kingpin, informant, and finally, a man who learned that being truly untouchable meant not avoiding the consequences of one's actions, but accepting them fully, and working to make sure that others need not repeat the same tragic journey from dreams to nightmares, and finally to a hard-won peace. The story of Nicky Barnes offers several important lessons for America today. First, it shows that criminal behavior often comes from wider social and economic conditions that must be addressed through complete approaches extending far beyond law enforcement. Simply arresting and imprisoning criminals doesn't solve the underlying problems that create them. Second, it shows the importance of providing legal opportunities for achievement and recognition to ambitious young people who might otherwise be attracted to criminal careers. Nicky's intelligence, charm, and organizational abilities could have made him successful in business, politics, or other legal fields under different circumstances. Third, it shows how corruption and institutional failure can enable criminal organizations to grow. The council's success was made possible not just by Nicky's abilities, but by corrupt police officers, uninterested politicians, and poor social services that left entire communities open to criminal use. Fourth, it shows both the power and the limits of law enforcement responses to organized crime. Operation Mr. Untouchable successfully took apart the council, but other criminal organizations quickly moved to fill the empty space, and the underlying drug trade continued to change and adapt. Today, more than 40 years after the council's peak, American cities continue to struggle with many of the same problems that enabled Nicky Barnes's rise. Drug trafficking organizations have become even more sophisticated and violent. Urban poverty and unfairness remain lasting challenges. The relationship between law enforcement and urban communities continues to be complicated and often troubled. But there have also been positive changes that suggest we can learn from the lessons of the past. Community policing programs work to build trust between law enforcement and residents. Drug treatment programs offer alternatives to prison for non-violent offenders. Economic development efforts seek to provide legal opportunities in underserved communities. The techniques developed during the investigation of the Council have been improved and expanded, making it more difficult for criminal organizations to operate without being caught. The willingness of criminals, like Nicky Barnes, to cooperate with authorities has become more common, giving law enforcement unprecedented understanding of criminal operations. As you think about Nicky Barnes's extraordinary life, consider how his story connects to the challenges facing your own community. Are there young people in your area who face limited legal opportunities for advancement? Are there communities that have been affected by drug trafficking or other forms of organized crime? Are there ways you can help create conditions that make criminal careers less attractive and legal success more achievable? The story of Mr. Untouchable reminds us that criminal behavior doesn't appear from nowhere. It develops within specific social, economic, and cultural situations that we all help shape through our choices. Our votes, our charitable giving, and our daily interactions with others. Every time we support programs that provide educational and economic opportunities to disadvantaged youth, we make it less likely that the next generation will produce another Nicky Barnes. Every time we vote for policies that address root causes of crime rather than just its symptoms, we help break the cycles that create both criminals and victims. The final judgment. Was Nicky Barnes a criminal mastermind who got what he deserved in the end? Was he a product of social conditions that limited his legal options? Was his cooperation with authorities a betrayal of criminal codes, or a form of redemption that served the wider public interest? These questions don't have simple answers, and different people will reach different conclusions based on their own values and experiences. But the questions themselves are important because they force us to think more deeply about crime, justice, and social responsibility in ways that go far beyond any individual case. The legend of Mr. Untouchable will last as both a warning and a complex human story. It shines light on some of the most challenging issues facing American society. His life reminds us that every choice has consequences. Every action affects others and every person, no matter how powerful or how fallen, remains capable of change. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson from Nicky Barnes's life is this: that being truly untouchable doesn't mean avoiding responsibility for our actions, but rather accepting full responsibility for them and working to make sure that others don't have to walk the same destructive path. True power lies not in controlling others or accumulating wealth through harmful means, but in contributing positively to our communities and leaving the world better than we found it. The streets of Harlem, where this story began, continue to echo with both the consequences of past choices and the possibilities of future redemption. In that echo lies a challenge for all of us to build a society where dreams need not become nightmares, where ambition can be directed toward positive ends, and where every person has genuine opportunities to achieve success through legal means. The story of Nicky Barnes is finished, but the wider story of which it forms a part continues. The next chapters will be written by the choices we make today about the kind of society we want to build and the opportunities we want to provide to future generations. In that ongoing story, we all have a role to play.